The evening light was soft on the streets of a town that at first glance might have seemed like a perfect postcard. The narrow sidewalks, the manicured lawns, the welcoming signs of the cafes with their homemade baked goods, everything seemed to say, "Welcome to a place where you are welcome." But behind this pleasant picture was another world, a world of whispers behind their backs, unspoken rules, and an underlying hatred that sprouted roots in their hearts like weeds in a noble flower bed. Among the people of the town was a 16-year-old boy named Marcus. He was called Invisible, but not because he was quiet or inconspicuous. Marcus was blind. Losing his sight as a child had robbed him not only of the ability to see the world, but also much else, the simple joys that his peers took for granted. However, he was not alone. He always had a loyal friend by his side, a golden Labrador named Charlie. This dog was more than just a guide for Marcus. He was his eyes, his support, his protector from the cruelty of a world that the boy could not see but could feel. Marcus liked to walk with Charlie in the old park, where the centuries-old trees made him feel safe. Here he knew every step, every bump, every rustle in the wind. And though many people shunned the boy, whether out of fear or contempt, he felt free. Charlie, with his soft breathing and confident movements, was like a guide not only to the physical world, but also to the world of peace of mind. But in a town where decency was a screen, even in these quiet moments, shadows of racism and prejudice broke through. People didn't always say their thoughts out loud, but their looks were more eloquent than any words. Marcus often felt like he was being judged. Black skin, disability, dependence on a dog. He was too different for this place. The words thrown back at him, the whispers that kind of thing doesn't belong here, reached him like an echo in a soundless world. That night, Marcus couldn't have known that his familiar walk would turn into a nightmare that would change everything. The dog led him on his usual route through the park, their quiet harmony unbroken by sounds or the presence of others. But behind the trees, someone was already watching. Eyes full of contempt and malice looked at this picture with a different mood. It was a police officer, James Reed, who had long harbored a latent hatred for anything that didn't fit his idea of order. He saw something in Marcus and Charlie that stirred his dark side. Why is he here? Reed thought, grabbing the belt where his baton hung. On the main street, meanwhile, life flowed as usual. People dined in restaurants, laughed in cafes, and cheered their children on the sports field. No one suspected that in just a few minutes one event would shake the whole town, making everyone look at themselves and their surroundings differently. And Marcus, smiling as always, put his hand down on Charlie's soft fur. The dog wagged his tail slightly, as if he realized that something important lay ahead of them. Perhaps he sensed the tension in the air, a harbinger of a tragedy that neither Marcus nor this small, seemingly perfect town could have predicted. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments what city or country you are from, and whether you have faced injustice, prejudice, or similar situations in your life. We'd be interested to hear your stories and opinions. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next installments of our stories. Now, back to the storytelling. Marcus moved along the familiar route, carefully pacing the park, trusting Charlie to lead him confidently forward. It smelled of damp earth after the recent rain, and the rare passers-by hurried home, not lingering under the evening sky. No one paid much attention to the boy. Almost no one. At one corner of the park he heard heavy footsteps and then a harsh, rough voice that pierced the silence. "Hey, kid." The voice was low, soaked with animosity. "Where do you think you're going, huh?" Marcus stopped, feeling the tension in the air. He instinctively put his arm around Charlie's waist. The dog growled, barely perceptible, but loud enough for the stranger to hear. "Dogs are forbidden here," the man continued, coming closer. "Or maybe you think there's no law for people like you?" Marcus, still not realizing who was in front of him, replied politely, "Excuse me, sir. This is my guide. We always walk around here. Don't bother anyone." But instead of answering, he heard heavy footsteps and felt someone grab his arm roughly. "For the likes of you?" James Reed snorted, jerking Marcus to the side. "Do you think you can walk wherever you want with your—" He glanced at Charlie and added with a venomous sneer, "With that dog?" "Please, sir," Marcus began, trying to remain calm. "We're not disturbing anyone." "No one?" Reed interrupted him, leaning closer. "You're already bothering me just by looking at you. The nigger with the dog. This is a circus, not a park." Charlie sprang forward, instinctively protecting his master. His loud bark echoed off the trees like an echo of alarm. It made Reed even angrier. "Quiet, dog," he shouted and took a step back, then reached for the baton on his belt. "This place is no place for the likes of you. Your dog, you're strangers here." Marcus, fists clenched, squeezed out through clenched teeth. "We didn't do anything wrong. Please leave us alone." But the words only fueled Reed's anger. He stepped closer, swung his baton, and slammed it to the ground beside Charlie. The Labrador snarled, stepping between the officer and Marcus. "You're brave, aren't you?" Reed grinned. "Let's see how long you can defend your master." The policeman grabbed Charlie by the collar and pulled him sharply toward him. The dog struggled violently, but the forces were unequal. Marcus shouted desperately, "Don't touch him. He didn't do anything. He's my guide." Reed ignored him. His face contorted with anger. He clamped his fingers around the dog's neck, ignoring its frantic attempts to break free. "So much for the guide," he said, exerting his strength. "You think he's special? No one here is special, okay?" Marcus tried to reach for Charlie, but Reed's rough hand pushed him back. The teenager fell, losing his balance, and at that moment he felt completely helpless. He couldn't see what was happening, but the sounds of his dog struggling and Reed's harsh breathing were unbearable. "Please, please," Marcus shouted, his voice trembling with desperation. "This is my only friend." But Reed wasn't listening. His actions were filled with a ferocity that seemed to rise from the darkest corners of his soul. And at that moment, when all seemed lost, the noise of the fight suddenly stopped. "We're done," Reed whispered, letting Charlie's lifeless body fall to the ground. He turned to Marcus, who, not realizing what had happened, was crawling toward where his faithful friend lay. "Get out of here while I'm being kind," the officer threw, "or you're next." Marcus knelt down beside Charlie. His fingers trembled as he fumbled with the dog's still body. The world around him was a black void, with only the sound of distant footsteps and a hoarse, throaty cry. Charlie lay on the ground, his body still shuddering in its last convulsive movements. Reed stood over him, breathing hard, clutching the leash in his hand. The officer's gaze was filled with a mixture of anger and satisfaction, as if he had just proven to himself his strength. Marcus, kneeling beside his friend's motionless body, still couldn't believe what was happening. "Charlie, get up," he whispered, his hands shaking as he tried to feel the dog, hoping it was just hurt. "Please, get up." Silence. No response. No tail wagging, no soft growl that always said Charlie was there to protect him. just the lifeless warmth beneath Marcus's fingers. "What are you doing?" Marcus shouted, his voice trailing off in pain. "It was just a dog. It didn't do anything." Reed looked at him as if the boy's words were some annoying noise he could easily ignore. He pulled off his leather gloves, slipped them into his pocket, and replied coldly, "It's not just a dog, it's a problem, and problems need to be solved." Marcus clenched his fists, his body trembling not from fear, but from rage and helplessness. "You had no right. She was my eyes." His voice trailed off into a hoarse scream. "You took my friend, my only friend." Reed stepped closer, his heavy boots hitting the ground with a thud. He leaned toward Marcus, making him feel his breath burn against his face. "And what are you going to do?" he hissed. "Go to the police? I am the law." Marcus heard that cold voice, full of confidence and impunity. Reed added with a chuckle, "Nobody's going to believe a blind kid against me. Forget it, okay? Forget it and get out of here before I change my mind." Marcus rose to his feet, gritting his teeth. He couldn't see Reed's face, but he could feel his contempt. It was as if the world around him had collapsed to a single point, the place where he'd just lost everything that meant safety to him. "I won't forget," Marcus said. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made Reed squint a little. "You'll regret it." Reed laughed. The laugh was rough and sinister, echoing through the park. He stepped back, glancing at Charlie's body, and brushed the dirt off his uniform and headed away. "We'll see which one of us is sorry," he tossed in parting. Marcus was alone. His fingers found Charlie's fur again, soft as ever. But that softness was no comfort now. He wrapped his arms around his dog, clinging to him as if that would bring his friend back to life. The tears poured down, burning his face. He cried not only for Charlie, but for his own helplessness, for the injustice that had shown its true face again. And in that moment, in the midst of this silent tragedy, something changed in Marcus. It wasn't just a loss. It was a spark ignited by pain. He didn't know how or what to do, but he knew one thing. The truth would not remain hidden. He would get justice, no matter what it took. The night was cold, despite the warm day. Marcus sat on the sidewalk at the entrance to the park, clutching the leash that no longer connected him to his faithful friend. His face was wet with tears, but now he just stared into the void, as if everything around him had ceased to exist. Passers-by slowed down, stopped, but no one dared to approach. They seemed to prefer to ignore his grief to avoid awkward questions or the need to do something about it. It was as if everything inside Marcus shattered. The silence he was immersed in was unnaturally loud, as if everything around him was crying out for loss. He felt as if he'd lost a part of himself with the loss of Charlie. Every breath came with difficulty, as if the air refused to fill his lungs. The only thing holding him to reality was a deafening but growing determination. He didn't know how he would live his life, but he knew one thing. Whoever had done this would not go unpunished. Meanwhile, Officer James Reed sat in his car in the deserted parking lot outside the police station. He lit a cigarette, nervously shaking the ash out the window. There was a strange feeling inside him. At first, it was satisfaction at what he had done. He thought he had put another extra from this town in his place. But now his thoughts took on a different form. He closed his eyes and saw Marcus's face, his trembling hands, his desperate cry. The boy's voice echoed in his head, and Reed, unwillingly, remembered every detail of what had happened. He shook his head as if he wanted to shake it off, but the scene came back again and again, like an annoying nightmare. It's just a kid, he muttered to himself, taking another deep drag. It's no big deal. It's a dog. It's just a dog. But the phrase brought no relief. He remembered Marcus saying, "You're going to regret this." Those words rang so clearly in his mind as if the boy were standing right next to him. Reed's fingers trembled and the cigarette fell out of his hands, leaving a charred trail on the seat. He cursed, but even that didn't help relieve the rising tension. Sitting in the car, he turned on the radio, trying to drown out the inner voice, but the news wasn't helping. Thoughts swarmed in his head. What if someone saw it? What if the boy tells someone? But then he convinced himself that no one would believe a blind teenager. He was a police officer, which meant he always had a trump card, his status. But even that thought did not calm him. Somewhere deep inside, an uneasiness was beginning to stir. It was like a cold lump in his stomach, impossible to ignore. It seemed to him that every glance from passers-by on the street was permeated with suspicion. Every phone call at the station made him flinch. The next day, Reed returned to duty. His co-workers greeted him as usual, but he felt something was different. Or was it just in his head? When one of the officers, Captain Harper, casually asked, "Why are you so jumpy today? Are you okay?" Reed, as if stung, replied a little too sharply, "Me? It's okay. What did you take?" Harper shrugged, but his gaze lingered on Reed longer than he'd expected. He thought he saw a flicker of doubt in the captain's eyes. Or was his imagination playing tricks on him again? Marcus, on the other hand, was sitting in a small room in his house. His father, the head of the state police, hadn't returned yet, and Marcus knew he had to tell him everything. He didn't want to relive that nightmare again, but he realized it was the only way to get justice. However, he was scared, not because of fear of his father, but because he might not believe him, or that no one would believe him. His hands clutched the leash as if there was a piece of Charlie in that piece of fabric. His heart ached, but that pain was fuel for something more. For the first time in his life, he felt the fear of the world give way to a determination to confront it. And somewhere deep inside, despite all his guilt and echoes of fear, James Reed felt that this story wasn't over. At the police station, the day began as usual. The sound of phones, the rustle of papers, and the low hum of conversations. Officer James Reed sat at his desk pretending to be busy with his reports, but there was still an uneasiness stirring inside him. He tried to concentrate on his work, but his thoughts returned again and again to the park, to the boy, to the dog, especially Marcus's last words, "You're going to regret this." Reed's alarm was heightened when the police chief's door swung open. Captain Harper entered the room, his face serious and his voice harsh. "Reed, come in here. Right away," he said, nodding toward the office. James's heart clenched. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. A sense of danger flared inside him, but he stood up, trying to look calm. "Is something wrong, sir?" he asked, entering the office, trying not to give away the tremor in his voice. Harper did not answer at once. He stood at the window, looking out at the street, and then turned, giving Reed a look that made him feel as if he were being interrogated. "We have a problem," Harper began, "and I'm afraid it has to do with you." Reed frowned, trying to remain calm. "Me? What do you mean, sir?" Harper went to his desk and picked up a folder with 3 letters on the cover. Emergency Department. He opened it, pulled out a photograph, and tossed it in front of Reed. There was a boy with a dog in the picture. Marcus, with a wide smile, holding Charlie's leash, looked happy, as if the whole world was a bright place for him. "Do you know this teenager?" Harper asked, crossing his arms over his chest. Reed felt everything turn upside down inside. It was the same boy. He struggled to keep his excitement in check. "It's the first time I've seen it," he lied, raising his eyes to the captain. Harper stared at him, and there was annoyance in his gaze. "Don't lie to me, Reed. This boy is the son of John Weston, head of the state police." The words sounded like thunder. James felt his breath hitch. He knew Weston's name. He was a man of iron grip and impeccable reputation, who did not tolerate mistakes and injustice in his team. And now it was turning out that the very boy he had humiliated and broken was his son. There must be some mistake. Reed squeezed out, his voice trembling. I didn't know." "Exactly, you didn't know," Harper replied sharply, leaning back in his chair. "But it doesn't matter, James. You might as well use your head. Weston already knows something's happened to his son, and if he finds out, it's connected to you." The captain fell silent, letting Reed think of the consequences for himself. James tried to hide his panic, but a feeling of dread spread through his body. He knew that Weston wouldn't let this case go unnoticed. "What am I going to do?" Reed finally asked, his voice sounding almost pitiful. Harper looked at him with a cold chuckle. "The only thing you can do is pray that the truth doesn't come out. But I can't promise you it won't. Weston's launched an investigation. He's on his way here." The captain's words sounded like a sentence. Reed realized he had no choice but to wait. He tried to walk back to his desk, but his legs wouldn't obey him. His mind replayed scenes from the park, the boy's screams, the wheezing of his dog. He felt his heart pounding so loudly that he thought the people around him could hear it. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his father's study. John Weston listened intently to his son's story. His face remained impassive, but inside he was seething. Every word Marcus spoke was like a knife to the heart. To know that his son had been subjected to such cruelty was unbearable. "Are you sure it was a policeman?" he asked quietly, barely able to contain his anger. "Yes, Father," Marcus answered, gripping Charlie's leash tightly. He wore the uniform, and I'll never forget his voice. Weston stood up, his figure seeming even more imposing. He picked up the phone and dialed a number, speaking in a hard, icy voice. "Harper, I need to see every one of your officers." Now, Reed didn't know that meeting John Weston would be the beginning of the end of his career, and his quiet life. The police station fell into a tense silence as John Weston stepped confidently through the door. Tall, with graying whiskers and a stern gaze, the state police chief seemed a man whose attention to detail was unwavering. His presence was felt physically, as if the air itself had become heavier. The officers, sensing this change, fell silent, averting their eyes. No one dared to speak as he strode purposefully toward Captain Harper's office. The door opened without a knock, and Harper, seated at his desk, flinched. Weston came in, looked around the office, and said quietly but firmly, "Where is he?" Harper stood up, realizing it was useless to resist. "Weston, I can explain everything." "Where is he?" Weston repeated, his voice lower but more menacing. The captain nodded toward the interview room. There, sitting in a metal chair, James Reed was nervously rubbing his cap in his hands. His face was pale and his legs trembled under the desk. He heard the door open and realized who had entered before he looked up. John Weston stopped on the threshold. His gaze met Reed's, and at that moment he felt the earth go from under his feet. It wasn't just anger. It was the icy fury of a man who was ready to go all the way. "Officer Reed," Weston began, sitting down across from him. His voice was steady, but each syllable was like a hammer blow. "Tell me what happened in the park." "Sir, this is a misunderstanding," Reed muttered, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't mean to. You just what?" Weston interrupted, slapping his palm on the table. "Just strangled my son's dog? Just humiliated him? Just show him that your uniform is just a cover for your hatred?" Reed fidgeted, trying to find an excuse, but the words stuck in his throat. He knew there was no use in denying it. Weston knew everything. "Minus I didn't know he was your son," Reed finally squeezed out, hoping that would soften the situation. Weston froze. Then he leaned closer, his eyes burning with anger. "Do you think it's important?" he hissed. "It doesn't matter whose son he is. He's a man who trusted the system I spent my life building, and you showed him that there is no justice in it." Reed tried to say something, but Weston gestured him to stop. "You broke trust," he continued, his voice ringing with steel. "You destroyed my family, and you will pay for it." "Sir, please give me a chance," Reed began, his voice trembling like a child about to be punished. "Chance?" Weston grinned, but it was the grin of a man who had long ago made his decision. "You want a chance? All right. You'll get a chance to explain yourself to the court, to my lawyers, to the whole town that's going to find out what you did." Reed remained silent, feeling the blood rush from his face. He realized that this meeting wasn't just a reprimand. It was a judgment. Weston stood up, his figure towering over Reed like a broken but still formidable pillar of justice. "Surrender your weapon and badge," he said firmly. "As of this moment, you are no longer an officer." Reed stood up, hesitantly taking his weapon out of its holster and removing the badge from his chest. His hands shook as he placed them on the table. Weston looked at the symbols of power that Reed had so shamelessly desecrated and turned away, as if he didn't want to see the man who wore them again. "You're free to go," Weston tossed over his shoulder before leaving the room. "Bye." When the door slammed behind Weston, Reed collapsed back into his chair, feeling his world crumble. He realized now that this story was far from over, and his nightmare had only just begun. Before we go any further, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened in your life. We're interested in hearing your thoughts and stories. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you don't miss out on the next chapters. And now we're continuing. The day after the confrontation between John Weston and James Reed, the city woke up different. The story of police brutality and the tragedy of a blind teenager began to spread with the speed of wildfire. It all started with a single article in the local newspaper. The journalist, who received information from an anonymous source, was not afraid to publish an article with a loud headline, "Blindness and Cruelty: How the System Betrayed a Teenager." From that moment on, a chain reaction began that could no longer be controlled. First came the rumors. People discussed the incident in cafes, in the markets, and at dinner. The city, used to hiding its prejudices behind a facade of decency, was suddenly the center of attention. Everyone wanted to know who was the teenager, who was the policeman, and how could this have happened in the first place. By the evening of the same day, the first group of protesters had gathered in front of the city administration building. They were mostly young people and students holding homemade placards with inscriptions: "Justice for Marcus," "Racism should not wear uniforms," and "The system doesn't work." Their anger and determination, at first seemingly a localized outburst of emotion, drew the attention of journalists and activists from neighboring towns. The next day, the crowd grew. People chanted slogans demanding investigation and justice. Amid the general outrage, local authorities began to panic. The city council, usually immersed in routine, was confronted with a situation that threatened to escalate into a major scandal. Meanwhile, social media literally exploded. Marcus and Charlie's story went viral. A video of his father, John Weston, vowing to get justice went viral. In the comments under the posts, people expressed support, and some shared their own stories of police brutality and injustice. Gradually, the story spread beyond the city limits, capturing national attention. For James Reed, the most difficult period of his life had begun. He could no longer hide. When the name of the policeman who had strangled the dog of a blind teenager became known, his house became a target. People came to his door, shouting insults, leaving threats. On the walls of his house appeared inscriptions, "Murderer," and "Your place is in jail." His phone was ringing off the hook, and social media was filled with threats. Reed was forced to leave his home and hide with relatives outside the city. Even there, he was haunted by the thoughts of what he had done. Every day he read the news, trying to predict how far this situation would go. It seemed to him that the whole world had turned against him, and for the first time in his life, he felt that his uniform and status no longer protected him. At this time, protests in the city were at their peak. Thousands of people filled the streets demanding Reed's immediate arrest and reform of the police system. Banners appeared on the facade of the police station with the words, "Equality for all," and "No to racism in the law." Protesters repeatedly tried to break into the building, but were held back by barriers and police. However, this only served to increase their fury. At one rally, John Weston, standing on a makeshift stage, addressed the protesters. His voice sounded firm, but there was deep pain in it. "I promise that justice will be served, not just for my son, but for everyone who has ever faced injustice. We must not be silent, and I will not let this story go quiet as it has in the past." His words caused a storm of applause. People saw him not only as a police chief, but also as a father who was willing to fight for his child. His determination was inspiring, and the protests began to become more and more organized. However, the louder the protests became, the more resistance the story met. Panic began to set in among local politicians and high-ranking officials. Some of them feared that the scandal would reach the federal level, which could damage the reputation of the entire region. Attempts were made to calm the situation by offering Weston compromises, but he refused. "It's not a question of compromise," he said in private meetings. "It is a question of truth." Meanwhile, Reed, sitting in hiding, began to realize that his life would never be the same. He no longer had any allies left. Colleagues who had once respected him for his toughness now shunned him. Everyone realized that he had become a symbol of a rotten system, and such people are not protected. Every day, watching the news, he saw the faces of the people who hated him, heard their angry cries, and felt that there was something bigger than himself behind this protest. It was a struggle against what he personified, and he knew it was a fight he could not win. The night in the rented apartment outside the city seemed especially long. James Reed sat in the dark room, staring at the faint light of the street lamp that filtered through the curtained window. He could feel the clock ticking louder and louder, its every movement seeming to burn a stigma of guilt into his mind. It was quiet all around him, too quiet, and that silence hummed in his head, making him relive that night in the park over and over again. He closed his eyes, but that only increased the flood of memories. Charlie's barking, Marcus's screams, the trembling voice of the boy begging for mercy for his only friend. Those sounds were now an inseparable part of his reality. Reed realized what he had done could never be undone, and every time he tried to justify himself by saying, "It was just a dog," his own thoughts interrupted. It was his guide, his friend, his eyes. "Why did I do that?" he whispered, clutching his temples. What was driving me? He tried to find excuses in the system, in his surroundings, in the years he had spent believing that force was the only way to maintain order. But his mind would not accept these excuses. The real reason was his hatred, his prejudices that had become a part of himself. And now that part of his soul was eating him from the inside out. Every morning started the same way. Reed woke up feeling heavy, as if a slab of concrete was pressing against his chest. He went online, despite his fear, and checked the news. There, as always, was his name, his face, his deed. The comments under the articles were filled with hate. Monster. Killer. Time to stop this. The words he read echoed in his head. He tried to drink to forget, but the alcohol only made him more anxious. In his drunken moments, he had visions of Charlie lying on the ground and Marcus reaching out to him. In these visions, the boy's voice would grow louder and louder until Reed would jump out of bed in a cold sweat. "I'm not a monster," he told himself, trying to believe it. "I just... wrong." But even that sounded fake. Reed thought back to Marcus's eyes. He hadn't seen those eyes at the time, but now his imagination was painting them empty, but full of pain. They were the same as his own when he had experienced his mother's death as a teenager. When he remembered it, he suddenly realized that the boy he had hated for no reason had become a mirror for him, reflecting all his faults and weaknesses. "I broke him," Reed whispered, looking down at his trembling hands. "I made him even more helpless." Meanwhile, outside his window, a tragedy for the city and society was unfolding. The protests did not subside but grew more and more violent. More and more often, news channels showed Marcus talking about his pain. He spoke calmly, but every word was like a stab in the heart for Reed. "Charlie was more than just a dog to me," Marcus said in an interview. "He was part of my family, and he was part of me. Now I feel like I've lost a part of myself." Those words echoed in Reed's head over and over until he closed the laptop with trembling hands. He tried to justify himself to himself. It was a mistake. It was an impulse. It was an accident. But the truth, like a dagger, pierced his soul. It was his choice. The fear was growing. Every ring on the phone made him flinch. Every knock on the door turned into the sound of a sentence. His sleep became brief flashes between nightmares. He saw crowds of people surrounding his house, their faces contorted with hatred. In these dreams, he heard Charlie barking, over and over until it turned into a howl. One morning, looking at his reflection in the mirror, Reed didn't recognize himself. His face looked tired, and his eyes were empty. He felt he couldn't live like this anymore. No excuses could obscure his guilt, and for the first time in his life, he thought of remorse. "I have to do something," he whispered, his voice sounding like an echo in the empty room. He sat down at his desk, picked up a paper, and began to write. The letter was addressed to John Weston. He poured out his soul in it, confessed his guilt, described his weakness. But most importantly, he wrote about the boy he had broken. It wasn't an excuse, it was an admission that he had become what he had hated all his life. When he finished, his hands were shaking. The letter lay before him as a symbol of his pathetic attempt to begin to make amends. But he knew it wasn't enough. It didn't matter how many times he apologized. He had ruined an innocent boy's life, and it would haunt him for the rest of his days. Meanwhile, at Marcus's house, his father was reading the letter. His face remained cold, but his eyes showed emotion. He knew that nothing Reed could say could undo what he had done. But deep down, he felt that Reed's fear and remorse were the beginning of his own punishment. The day of the trial came, and it was an event that changed not only the lives of the participants, but also the life of the city itself. The court building was surrounded by a huge crowd. Protesters, journalists, gawkers. They held placards. Justice for Marcus. Zrania, the system must work. Swing, no forgiveness for police brutality. Cameras of news channels lined the sidewalk, capturing every moment of this high-profile case. James Reed sat in his car in front of the courthouse. He felt like the whole world was pressing down on him. His palms were damp with sweat, his heart pounding as if it were about to burst out of his chest. He knew that what awaited him inside wasn't just a trial, it was humiliation, the exposure of all his mistakes in front of hundreds of people. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and gathering his courage, got out of the car. The courtroom was full. Reed walked in, trying not to look at the faces of those present, but he felt their gazes on him, cold, judgmental. He heard the whispers, heard his name spoken with hatred. This was the beginning of his public punishment. On the opposite side of the room sat Marcus and his father. Marcus looked calm, but behind that outward restraint there was determination. His father, John Weston, held his son's hand as if to give him his support. The trial began with statements from the parties. Reed's lawyer tried to portray everything as an accident, as a moment of weakness caused by stress. But each argument sounded unconvincing when confronted with the facts presented by the prosecution. Then it was Marcus's turn. When the boy stood up, the hall was silent. Every eye was fixed on him. He stepped forward, leaning on his white cane, and his voice sounded confident despite the trembling in his hands. "I've been blind since childhood. My only window to the world is sounds, smells, and touch. Charlie wasn't just a dog to me. He was my eyes. He was my friend. And this man," Marcus turned his head toward Reed, his voice deepening, "took him away from me. For no reason, just because he could." Marcus's words struck to the heart. He talked about how helpless he felt when he realized he could no longer trust the system that was supposed to protect him. His story was full of pain, but there was no hate in it, just the truth. "I will never see this man," Marcus finished, pointing at Reed, "but I will remember his voice forever. It's the voice of injustice, and I don't want anyone else to hear it." There was silence in the hall. Some people wiped away tears. Even the judge, experienced and restrained, looked shocked. When the floor was given to Reed, he rose slowly. His voice shook as he began to speak. "I have no excuses. What I did was terrible, and I don't ask for forgiveness because I know you can't earn it. All I can say is, I was wrong. I ruined that boy's life, and I know I can never make it right." His words sounded sincere, but they were not sympathetic. For many in the audience, it was too late. The trial concluded with the announcement of the verdict. Reed was found guilty of abuse of authority, cruelty to an animal, and discrimination. He was stripped of his rank, sentenced to prison, and ordered to pay a hefty restitution. But the biggest punishment for him was not that. It was in the eyes of the people who looked at him as a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. As Reed left the hall, the crowd met him with a roar of hatred. People shouted insults, demanded more punishment. His humiliation was complete. He was no longer an officer, no longer a man to be trusted. He had become an outcast. For Marcus, this day was a step forward. He knew nothing would bring Charlie back, but he felt he had accomplished something important. His voice had been heard. The truth had come out, and it gave him hope. As she and her father left the court, people surrounded them with applause. Some offered help, others simply thanked them for their courage. Marcus smiled. He no longer felt alone. It was the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, a chapter where justice could be served, even if it meant going through pain. Several months had passed since the trial. The city was slowly returning to its normal life, but for its inhabitants the story had left a deep mark. The streets, once filled with the anger of protesters, were now quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet, one filled with the realization that the system can make mistakes, and that those mistakes come with a price. For Marcus, his family, and James Reed, life would never be the same. Marcus sat in his favorite park, listening to the rustle of the wind in the leaves. His cane lay beside him, but he no longer held it as tightly as he used to. He had a new guide with him, a young Labrador named Bruno. Bruno was energetic and loyal, but Marcus still missed Charlie. The memories of his first guide were vivid, and every time he thought of him, a warm but bitter wave rose in his heart. Marcus, however, has changed. After the trial, his voice became important to many. He spoke in schools, at community meetings, about the rights of people with disabilities, about discrimination, and about the importance of fighting for justice. He no longer felt defenseless. People began to see him as a leader, as someone who could survive tragedy and turn it into a powerful tool for change. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I went through," he once said in an interview. "The world has to change, and I am ready to be part of that change." The words sounded confident, but at night, alone with himself, Marcus still felt the pain. He'd lost not only Charlie, but also that part of his naive belief that the world was fair. But perhaps that loss had made him stronger. For John Weston, the story was a personal challenge. He remained head of the state police, but his working methods changed. He began selecting officers more carefully and organized mandatory anti-discrimination training. He met with the public and listened to their complaints and questions. His goal was to create a system that not only his son, but everyone in the city could trust. "I had a choice," he said in one of his speeches, "either to keep silent and protect the structure, or to recognize its mistakes and do everything possible to ensure that these mistakes are not repeated. I chose the latter." However, Weston knew that fixing the system was a long process. He had to fight resistance within the police force itself, political pressure. But he wouldn't back down. He always had the image of Marcus that night in his mind, his tears, his despair. He couldn't afford to forget it. James Reed served his time in prison, but not even the cell walls could protect him from the consequences. He became an outcast among both prisoners and guards. His name was associated with shame, and every day he heard taunts and insults. What tormented him most, however, was his conscience. Nights he sat on his hard bunk, staring at the ceiling, and relived that night in the park over and over again. He tried to understand when everything had gone wrong. His hatred, his rage, his belief that he had the right to judge people, it all seemed monstrous to him now. He wrote letters to Marcus, but none of them were sent. He didn't know how to apologize for something that couldn't be forgiven. "Maybe I deserve all of this," he whispered to himself in the silence of the cell, "but all I want is for him to know that I'm sorry." After his release, Reed did not return to his hometown. He became a ghost, disappearing from the society that had rejected him. No one knew where he was, but everyone remembered who he was. The city had changed. People could no longer turn a blind eye to injustice. This story shook them up, made them rethink the way they treated each other. New laws, new support programs, stricter oversight of police officers, all of these were the result of what once began as a tragedy. But, as with any story, there is an indelible pain left behind. For many, Marcus became a symbol of resilience, but they forgot that he was just a man who had lost a friend and endured horror. For Reed, it was the end of his life as he knew it, and for the town, it became a lesson for which a high price had to be paid. This story is not about victory or defeat. It's about truth that sometimes hurts but needs to be heard. It is about people who can change, even when it seems too late. It's about how justice is not only a punishment, but an opportunity for all of us to be better. Marcus knew his life would be full of new challenges, but he also knew that he would never be silent again. And in that silence, in that pain, a new power was born, the power of truth that changed everything. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and stories are very important to us because every response helps us better understand what we all have in common. We appreciate each and every one of you and are grateful to have had you with us. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories, and give us a like if you've been interested. We wish you a good day and justice in every step you take.